Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, good day to you. That's depending where you are in the world. I'm here live in London doing a nighttime devotion. The devotional is called Conflict in Courage. Today's title, Greatness in Humiliation. Micah 7 verse 8 and 9. When I sit in darkness, the Lord shall be a light unto me. I will bear the indignation of the Lord, because I have sinned against him, until he pled my cause and execute judgment for me. Conscience was uttering bitter and humiliating truths to David, while his faithful subjects wondered at his sudden reverse of fortune. It was no mystery to the king. He had often had forebodings of an hour like this. He had wondered that God had so long borne with his sins and had delayed the merited retribution. And now, in his hurried and sorrowful flight, his feet bare, his royal robes changed for sackcloth, the lamentations of his followers awaking the echoes of the hills, he thought of his loved capital, of the place which had been the scene of his sin. And as he remembered the goodness and long-suffering of God, he was not altogether without hope. Many a wrongdoer has excused his own sin by pointing to David's fall, but how few there are who manifest David's penitence and humility. How few would bear reproof and retribution with the patience and fortitude that he manifested. He had confessed his sin, and for years had sought to do his duty as a faithful servant of God. He had laboured for the upbuilding of his kingdom, and under his rule it had attained no strength and prosperity never reached before. He had gathered rich stores of material for the building of the house of God, and now was all the labour of his life to be swept away. Must the results of years of consecrated toil, the work of genius and devotion and statesmanship, pass into the hands of his reckless and traitorous son, who regarded not the honour of God nor the prosperity of Israel? How natural it would have seemed for David to murmur against God in this great affliction. But he saw in his own sin the cause of his trouble. And the Lord did not forsake David. This chapter, in his experience, when under the cruelest wrong and insult, he shows himself to be humble, unselfish, generous, submissive, in one of the noblest in his whole experience. Never was the ruler of Israel more truly great in the sight of heaven than at this hour of his deepest outward humiliation. And as the title said, greatness in humiliation. David, as is said here, considered a man after God's own heart. And as I've said before, he sinned. He sinned doing most sins that men would do. He did sin a lot, and he did all the types of sin that most men would consider not to be forgivable. But with David, he repented of all his sins. And in doing so, as we read at the end, this chapter in his experience, when he was under the cruelest wrong and insult, he was humbled, he became unselfish, generous, and submissive. And this time in his life was one of the noblest in his whole experience. And never was a ruler of Israel more truly great in the sight of heaven. Never was a mere mortal human, and of course we can't count Jesus there, ever more deeply admired by heaven than at this time when he was at his deepest of outward humiliation. And yet he still stayed true to God. And that's the problem with us. We can have everything. We can have the money, the dwelling, the position, the power, the responsibility. And when we have all that, we are then in such a position that a lot of people will look at us like a god, simply because they want the power, or they want the position, or they want the responsibility, or they want the car, or they want the house, or they want the whole lifestyle that you are showing to have. But the thing is, the more you have in all this, the more you have in all this, the more you have in your clothes, in your car. If you have all that, you'd be lacking that. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with having nice things, good quality things. But what have you got a lot of that for? Just for outward show? Yes, you can get a good position at work through your own merit. You have to be very, very careful. Like David, once you get up there, it can be a very long fall back down there. He suffered that humiliation, still stayed true to God. How true would you stay?